Hello, hello. If you follow me on Twitter, which you should, it's at the Viveros, you'll know that this was not the original topic I was going to do, but due to a whole bunch of nonsense, the much longer video I was working on, the missing link in competitive Overwatch, has to be pushed back to the next video. If that sounds like a topic that you'd be interested in and you don't want to miss, be sure to subscribe, turn on notifications, all that good stuff if you haven't already. In the meantime, we're going to tackle a shorter subject that I want to cover. Tilting is a skill issue. To start with, what does it mean to tilt? When somebody tilts in a game, we're basically just talking about someone getting so upset that they're messing up their own game and potentially the game of others. The term and meaning originally actually comes from pinball. On old pinball tables, you could tilt the table to try and guide the ball away from traps or into better positions. However, this had the potential to damage the machines and undermine the way the game was meant to be played, so manufacturers built in the tilt mechanic. Now if you try and tilt the machine too much, the machine will sense it, and it'll automatically disable the flippers, meaning that you are powerless for the rest of the round. Tilting the machine has become almost a skill test to some degree. Players can try and tilt the machine as much as possible without triggering the kill switch, but it's also possible to trigger by getting angry and shaking it, and this is where it comes from for our purposes. In gaming context, we tend to use tilting as synonymous with getting angry, but it's more than just anger. Getting angry, frustrated, annoyed, or upset with how a game is going if it's going poorly is inevitable to some extent. If the game matters to you and you see your performance as a reflection of your own value or skill to some extent, then of course you'll be unhappy if it's not going your way. Whether it's because you're just having an off day and you're making some dumb mistakes, or because your teammates are the ones making some dumb mistakes, or your opponents are just cracked out of their minds and you can't seem to do anything to stop them, those emotions happen, they're natural. Tilting, I would argue, isn't an emotion. It's more analogous to a status effect, like an ability lockout. You can still play the game, but you're severely restricted in what you can do and the impact you can have. A tilted player will have worse aim, positioning, target prioritization, and more. This status effect is also contagious. A tilted player rarely tilts alone, and tends to knock the rest of the team down like dominoes. This can be indirect, such as a tilted player playing so poorly that it causes other players to tilt as well, or direct, such as a tilted player using team chat to tilt their teammates, either intentionally or just because they are too tilted to know better. While there are a lot of emotions that can cause tilting, it isn't an inevitable outcome of those emotions. Much like tilting the table in pinball, a lot of them can actually be pretty valuable in a competitive environment. Things like frustration with how the game is going or anger or whatever else can motivate you. They can light a fire under your ass. They can give you a second wind, but only if you're in control and only up to a certain point. If you're not careful and you let it go too far, you trigger the tilt status effect. And suddenly you've just severely disadvantaged yourself, maybe for the rest of that game, maybe for multiple games. We've all seen somebody tilt, and if we're being honest, we've all tilted at one point or another ourselves. However, I said it was a skill issue. What do I mean by that? A competitive game like Overwatch is basically just a ton of overlapping skill tests happening all at once. You're tested on your aim, your positioning, your mobility, your game sense, your situational awareness, all that stuff that people think of when they think of skills that they can improve in their game. However, tilting isn't really discussed in the context of skill very often. Most of the time, a player's likelihood of tilting is treated more like an inherent stat that they have. They are either somebody who is likely to tilt or not. It's not something they can train, not something they can improve, it's defined by your nature. There's also the perspective that tilting is more of an emergent outcome of skill deficiencies in general. The idea that a player who's bad at the game in terms of aim, positioning, mobility, game sense, situational awareness, all that stuff we talked about before, is someone who's more likely to tilt. I would argue that both of those positions are wrong, and that tilt is a self-inflicted status effect as the result of failing a skill check. Bad players are more likely to demonstrate tilt not because they're bad at other skills, but because this is a skill that they are also bad at. A player is also not locked into a single predefined likelihood to tilt natural state, like it's not something that they are born to have. It is a skill that they can either train or neglect, and that is why it's important to recognize it as a skill. You cannot solve a problem until you correctly identify the problem. If you think that tilt is just the result of being bad at other elements of the game, then you might focus on improving your aim or positioning without trying to train your resistance to tilt, and you won't see the progress you want to see. If you think that resistance to tilt is just a natural, inherent state that can't be affected, then you'll just accept your low skill in this field as if it's just a part of who you are. And if you take either of these approaches, not only will you not get better, you will get worse, because frustration at things not working the way you expect them to is one of the things that will test your resistance to tilting. In Overwatch, skills are broadly broken down into one of two categories by the community: mechanical skill and game sense. Mechanical skill is the shooting, the moving, the pressing of the buttons, all that stuff, while game sense is the cerebral side of things, the strategy, the thought process, all that good stuff. However, this binary thinking leaves out a third category: psychological skills. At some point in the future, I'd like to make a whole video about different ways psychological skills play a role in games, but for our purposes, we're just focusing on resistance to tilt as a psychological skill. Contextualizing it like this is actually really important, because the way we classify skills is based just as much on how we improve them as anything else. Mechanical skills are improved by mechanical practice. You might go to an aim trainer to practice your shots in a controlled environment, and then take that to a quick play match to practice it in a more typical game environment, like stuff like that. Game sense skills are things that you can improve in like a classroom context. It's about thinking about the game more. You might review your VODs to see where you made mistakes in your positioning, or watch YouTube videos from better players who can explain things like counter picks, the mechanics of various abilities, where you should set up on certain maps, that kind of thing. But what is a psychological skill? And why do they matter? Psychological skills collectively make up your state of mind in a game. They are your ability to connect with other people, your ability to read the room, your ability to keep your emotions under control, all that good stuff. If mechanical skill is your aim, and game sense is your knowledge of who to aim at, psychological skill is your ability to calm down so you can land the shot. You could also call them emotional skills, but I think they go beyond that into your broader psychological state. How do you process your emotions? Are you able to handle the psychological burden of recognizing your own fault in a situation, or do you shift blame to everyone else? Are you capable of feeling emotions like anger or frustration and still consciously deciding to not let them affect you? Those are examples of psychological skills, and they are a major defining element of really any competition, including Overwatch. And it's important to give a name to this category of skills, because without a classification, they're harder to understand in a broader context, which in turn makes it hard to figure out how to train them. Imagine if we didn't have the term game sense to serve as a catch-all for all those skills that go beyond mechanical skill and focus on how you think about the game. You might want to learn more about how to play Overwatch, so you go to YouTube to find a tutorial and you hear a pro player talking about the importance of positioning. You recognize positioning as an important thing, but without the term game sense or the context of what it is, you not only lack a broader understanding of the skills it overlaps with, but how to train them. You might try to train your positioning as if it's a mechanical skill, and play 100 quick play games where you're just practicing standing in the right physical spots that you think you're supposed to be in. But positioning isn't a matter of the correct mechanical skills as much as an understanding of where to stand relative to your team, the enemy team, the point, what comps both teams are running, all that stuff. Recognizing that positioning is part of a class of skills that also includes counterpicking and tracking the ult economy, for example, allows you to not only understand the role that positioning plays in the game as a skill, but also how to train it and the factors that affect it. This already actually happens with psychological skills. Any big Overwatch YouTube channel, whether they're a pro, they're a streamer, whatever, they talk about this sort of stuff. For example, you might watch a Flats video where he says that lower ranked competitive matches often come down to which team tilts first and which team tilts hardest, with his point being that just being able to resist tilt for longer than your opponents, or at least just not tilt as hard, is one of the defining factors of whether or not you're going to succeed at lower ranks. This is good advice, and I want to make it clear up front, not a dig at Flats. This is not critical of him in that sense. He offers a lot of really good advice, especially to those lower level players, and I don't think this is an issue of him making a mistake. Rather, this is an issue of the entire gaming community and kind of people at large not really recognizing that psychological skills are a class of skills. When Flats says that low rank games are heavily defined by resistance to tilt, well, my words, not his, a player who genuinely wants to improve might agree with him, but not understand what it would mean to change that. By recognizing resistance to tilt as a psychological skill, however, we're putting it in a context that explains the role it plays and giving people an indication of how to train it. And that brings us to the final section. How do you train your resistance to tilt? So if I've done my job properly and you're still on board, you're probably thinking, okay, so resistance to tilt is a psychological skill that can be trained. I'm on board. But you still haven't explained what it actually means to train a psychological skill like resistance to tilt. The fun part of this is you don't need any sort of training equipment. I'm not going to sell you a supplement, and it doesn't even really require a lot of exhausting effort. It does, however, require you to spend some time with your own thoughts, which is a prospect I find so personally terrifying that it feels borderline unethical for me to recommend it to anyone, but I persist. And I will say up front, this process is going to sound a bit cringe, so fair warning, but frankly, if you're this invested in Overwatch and getting better at it, then you've already shot the moon on cringe. Don't worry too much about it. The first step is being able to consciously identify your emotions as they're occurring and the impacts that they're having on you. You can do this during a game, or even practice it in your everyday life. It wouldn't hurt. Keep a little notepad at your desk while you're playing, or in your pocket throughout the day, and at regular intervals, make a note of how you're feeling in the moment. Record yourself playing Overwatch matches for a while. Every time you die, use the time while you're waiting to respawn to write down the first word that comes to mind to describe how you're feeling in the moment. While you're recording yourself, act like you're streaming. Over-explain how you're feeling in the moment off the top of your head pretty much throughout. Make it a stream of consciousness. Whenever you have a game where you can recognize that you got tilted, save that VOD somewhere safe. Come back to it a few days later when you have some distance. Watch it back and review how you were feeling in the moment in terms of the notes that you took and what you said throughout the VOD. The big thing you're looking for here is the moment where your performance starts to dip and how you were feeling in those moments compared to games where you didn't notice yourself tilting. Do you often find yourself getting angry or frustrated? If so, what's the target of the emotion? Did you feel like a teammate dropped the ball? Did you get screwed over by lag? Did your team stagger and just give the enemy team a bunch of progress? What is the cause here? What we're looking for here is the causal relationship of tilt, or the relationship between two variables where a change in one, the independent variable, directly causes a change in another, the dependent variable. You want to be able to identify not just what makes you tilt, but also what doesn't. Using myself as an example, I'm less likely to get tilted by my teammates if they're underperforming, and I'm more likely to tilt when someone's getting angry in voice chat. If you get mad when a point is lost, but that doesn't correlate with a change in your performance, then you're presumably passing the skill test there. However, if you notice that your performance drops every time you're playing Farah and your Mercy steps away for a second to keep someone else alive and you end up dead, you've identified the independent variable in the causal relationship. In other words, you found the conditions where you'll fail the resistance to tilt skill test. And that's great. The first step to improving any skill is identifying why you're bad at the skill. If your aim sucks, you should try everything from more practice to also a different mouse or different sensitivities to see which variable is the issue for you. The same is true for resistance to tilt. Unlike with fixing your aim though, the hardest part is in identifying the problem. The easier part, at least in my opinion, is implementing the solution. In our scenario, we've already identified that you tilt when you're playing a damage hero and feel like your supports aren't pocketing you enough. This might be most noticeable with Farah and Mercy because Pharmacy is such a strong pair, but once you identify it in the most obvious contexts, you'll start noticing it in more subtle ones. The way you improve this skill is to keep playing the game, and when it happens again, recognize the scenario for the skill test that it is. This game is testing to see if I tilt, because my Mercy wasn't where I wanted her to be, and I will pass this test. Take a deep breath, count to 5, remind yourself that this is a crossroads. You can either allow this to get under your skin and hurt your performance, or you can move on. If you've watched me stream, subtle plug, twitch.tv/thevivaros, Tuesday through Thursday evenings, you'll hear me say it is what it is, pretty much constantly whenever something frustrating is happening. It's not like a meaningless statement, it's not a placeholder, it's a conscious decision to say what has happened has already happened, and it can't be changed. I just have to work with what I've got. If you're training your resistance to tilt, it is what it is a good mantra to adopt. Once you've identified a factor that makes you tilt, focus on that specific factor. Play a lot of Farah, record your games, take note of your emotions just like before, with particular focus on the times when those conditions are being met and how you respond. If you're taking it is what it is to heart, you'll notice yourself starting to tilt less severely, and maybe not even tilting at all sometimes in those conditions. This process requires some willingness to be lenient with yourself. You will still tilt during this process the same way that you'll still miss some shots when you're training your aim. Don't let it get you down, and don't let it make you feel like it's impossible. I genuinely promise you this is a commitment that if you keep this process up, you will start to notice your resistance to tilt trending upwards. Nobody's perfect, everyone gets tilted now and then, but if you can go from getting tilted in every other game you play to getting tilted in like every 10th game, that's major progress. 40% of your games where you used to get tilted are now ones where you're not getting tilted, meaning you're improving your odds and also probably enjoying the game more. And you might be thinking that in the Far Mercy example, there are going to be times where your Mercy genuinely drops the ball and that your frustration is totally valid. That's true. Like, that's just true. There's no two ways around that. And honestly, those are the hardest tilt checks to pass. It's one thing to not allow your own mistakes to tilt you, because you can, come to terms with the fact that you screwed up, your actions cause your consequences. But it can be a lot harder to let it go when somebody else has dropped the ball, when somebody else's mistake is leading to you facing consequences. The important thing to remember is that you can't fix that by being tilted. They will not play better if you tilt at them. If they're also bad at resisting tilt, frankly, they'll also play worse. Also, remind yourself that you're at the rank you're at for a reason. If you're playing in gold, you and the people you're playing with aren't going to be professionals. It's not a matter of if they drop the ball, it's a matter of when. It's gonna happen from time to time, and you are going to have to resist the urge to tilt when it happens. Especially because you also are not immune to making mistakes either. Again, we're all at the rank we're at for a reason. You're probably pretty close to on par with the people you're playing with. Part of playing a competitive game is being able to accept that you and your teammates are human beings with flaws who will make bad decisions and bad plays. The hardest skill test for your resistance to tilt will be the times where you legitimately feel like you did everything right and everyone else dropped the ball. And if you can build that resistance to tilt to the extent that you don't tilt even when you did everything right and still lost, you're well positioned to win a lot more games. And that's where this one's going to end. I apologize if my voice has been a little bit messed up or I've mispronounced some stuff. Poison air has kind of wrecked my ability to talk properly. Thank you for watching. This is a topic that I really enjoy exploring, and I hope you've enjoyed it too. Be sure to like, comment, subscribe, all that good stuff, and if you found the video helpful, please feel free to share it around a bit. If you'd like to watch another video from me, YouTube should be showing you 2 other videos I've done recently in just a second, and if you'd like to catch up with me, you can find me on Twitch at twitch.tv/thevivaros and on Twitter at thevivaros. Links to both and everything else are in the description. Until next time, I'll see you soon.